All right, we're ready for Psalm 120 to 122 in our study. These are shorter psalms, and we have divided because we took what was remaining and put those in two trimesters and we divided them up by 3 psalms per week, and so that obviously is going to catch some longer psalms together and some shorter psalms together. And so we have some shorter psalms. Total of 24 verses in our study. And yet we need to talk about the section that we're in, and we'll spend a little bit of time doing that. But we're looking at Psalm 120 to 122. We are in the 5th book of the Psalms. As you know, the Psalms are divided by books. And this is the 5th book starting at 107, and we'll be in that to the end of the Psalms. So these focus on the Word of God. That's not all that's there, but that's the primary focus as you take the overall view of the Psalms. So Psalm 120 to 134 are songs of ascent, and that answers one of your questions in your handout. What type of psalm is this? Well, the answer is this is a song of ascent or degrees. And there's much question as to what that is and what that means, and so we'll talk a little about that. When we get through talking about that, your answer to that is, if you don't know what that means, is you'll say, I still don't know, because I still don't know fully what that means. Well, there is some conjecture that we will talk about. There are 15 such psalms that are called the Psalms of Ascent, or Psalms of Degree, or steps. And so what is all of that about? That is, this word, if you look at the heading is put there in the Hebrew text. That is like Psalm 120. It says a song of ascents, and so Psalm 121, 122, and of David, that's in the Hebrew text. Not all of that shows up in the Septuagint, like for example of David in Psalm 122 doesn't show up in the Vulgate translation or in the Septuagint, but it did in the Hebrew text, and so we hold that indeed that is the case. But that's for Psalm 122. So there are 15 psalms that are labeled as the Psalm of Ascent. But that word for ascent, as I mentioned, and that's where I was headed a moment ago and got sidetracked, means degrees or steps. So it gives the idea of taking some steps or making progress, some progression, or ascending somewhere. I'll get to that in just a second. I think Haley perhaps captured one of the best thoughts I've read on that, and that is various explanations have been suggested for their use and arrangement, none of which is satisfactory. It is impossible now to know definitely. Well, when we get through here, that's what you're going to conclude. That there is no way for sure to know this is what the Song of Ascent means. Now, we can take the psalm and have an understanding of what that psalm is. And so I can know what Psalm 120 is saying. I can know what 121, 122, all the way through 134. But how are they related in the sense of the steps? Well, here's where there's some conjecture. A number of concepts have been given. Some suggest, and this is the most popular and the more common idea, point 2 here, these may be songs that were sung on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the 3 annual feasts. And so as they ascend toward Jerusalem, some have suggested, for example, let's just take Psalm 120 to 123. Can we be definite about this? No. This is just a strong suggestion. That maybe 120 is to be sung as they are approaching Jerusalem and they can see it, are getting close, not quite seeing it yet. Psalm 121, the city is in sight. And some evidence of that may be at verse 1 of Psalm 121. 122 may have to do with being within the gates based on verse 2. We have now arrived. And Psalm 123, they're within the city. Now, is that for sure what took place? I don't know. I can't be dogmatic. I can't be sure about that. That is the most common explanation of that. Another explanation is that these are general ascent or progression in thought, and they have nothing to do with going to Jerusalem or ascending to Jerusalem or the annual feast. Well, I want to go back, though, to point 2 and suggest that there may be something to that based on Psalm 122. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord. There's something about going to the house of the Lord and that is in these Psalms. Is that 100% proof? No. But back to point 3, it may have reference to just some degrees of progression of thought. For example, Psalm 121 Psalm 120 deals with the cry for a problem. Psalm 122 is the answer that God is our keeper. And so there's a progression of thought. Maybe that's what's involved in the songs of ascent. So you look at each psalm and there is some connection in that sense. I'm not convinced of this, but I found this one quite interesting. W. Graham Scroggie, in his large work on the Psalms, say this section of Psalm 120 to 134 belong to the period of Hezekiah. And so let's turn over to Isaiah 38 and verse 20. And what he does is quote some early scholars, early compared to us, that is, like in the 1800s, who had hinted at that, and then another one would pick that up and hint at it again or state that without any evidence. And then later in the 1900s, another scholar that Scroggie quotes developed it a little more fully. And to say the least, it was an interesting read to read through that. But his point is the significance of the 15. Now, I'm not convinced of this. I'm just telling you a theory. That the 15 songs are representative of the 15 years of his life being extended. And Isaiah 38 and in verse 20, that Hezekiah said, the Lord was ready to save me, therefore I will sing my songs on stringed instruments all the days of my life. And those who theorize that this fits in the days of Hezekiah, these are his songs, with the exception of the 4 of the 15 that are attributed to David and the 1 to Solomon. The rest of them are anonymous. Is that the case? I don't know. It's just an interesting thought. I think point 2 probably makes more sense. Now, 10 of these are anonymous, 4 are attributed to David and 1 to Solomon. Some think these fit into the post-exile period. I'm not convinced of that. And so what about David then? The thought is that these were assembled in a miniature psalter in the day of the post-exile period and borrowing then from David to fit the songs of ascent. Again, I don't know. I haven't given you anything that you can stick your finger on and say, I know for sure yet. Now, here's something we can be a little more sure of, and that is, while these psalms seem to have some connection, they're all called Psalms of Ascent, the temple seems to be still standing, which makes me think it's probably not the post-exile period where the temple had been destroyed and they're trying to rebuild that. You say, well, what about David? It may have been borrowed from David, though David was not talking about the temple. He would have been talking about the tabernacle. The thing, Loophole develops that thought a little further. But Psalm 22 and verse 1 and verse 9 and Psalm 24, 1 and 2 seem to allude to the place of worship is still standing. And I'm not trying to contrast the temple to the tabernacle, but I'm contrasting the temple standing or the place of worship is standing versus the day of the post-exile period. Most of the 15 mention an enemy that is present. Who is the enemy? We're not told. But if it fits in the days of Hezekiah, as Scroggie surmises, that would be Sennacherib, obviously. And he builds a good case for that, though I'm still not convinced fully of that. All right, questions or comments or insights on the Psalms of Ascent? You don't know any more than you did, I know. But what that does is convince you that you say, I don't really know what's going on here. Nobody else does either. And so to me, that's encouraging that when I get through and nobody else knew any more than I did about what these are. And so that helps me a little bit. Hopefully it does you. All right, let's talk about Psalm 120. What's the point of the message of Psalm 120? Short psalm. All right, it is a cry for deliverance. You may call it something else, call it what you wish, but when we get through, if we understand the psalm, we're going to all say something about the same concept of it's a cry for deliverance. And so in my distress I cried to the Lord, he said. So here's what happens in the psalm. Three things happen here. Verses 1 and 2 talk about the cry for deliverance from a slanderer. Verses 3 and 4, the cry for punishment of the oppressor, that same slanderer. Is that one person? Is that a nation? Is that a group of people? I don't know. But the people of God, or the psalmist, whoever this is, this one is anonymous. Whoever this is suggesting that he, and I think probably standing for the people of God, are oppressed by a slanderer, and he cries for punishment of the oppressor. And then there's the cry, because I dwell among the ungodly. Now, one of the things that needs to be pointed out about this psalm, the psalmist is offended. But this is not a minor offense. Now develop that for me. Then I'll develop it. First, do you agree with that? He is offended because there is an oppressor, a slanderer, and he says, I'm dwelling among the ungodly. And you say, well, I can identify with that because I got my feelings hurt. You think that's what he's talking about?
No, he's talking about lying lips, being deceitful, arrows and fire of room.
Yeah. This is not a minor offense. This is such that he is crying out to God for the oppressor to be punished for that, severely punished for this oppression. So this is not a minor offense. Can we identify, maybe in some sense, shape, form, or fashion we can identify, but it's highly unlikely that any of us have experienced the kind of thing this psalmist has experienced. So let's start with verses 1 and 2. He cries out for deliverance from the slanderer. He starts with assurance. What's his assurance in verse 1? Yeah, I cried out to God. I cried out to the Lord, and he heard me. Is he talking about this offense? Maybe. But I want to think that he's talking about historically, I've cried out to God before. I've cried out to God before. He heard me. He answered me. He delivered me. So I'm crying out now in the midst of this. What's your problem now, psalmist? Well, here it is. Deliver my soul, O Lord, from lying lips and from a deceitful tongue. There is someone slandering the psalmist's cohorts, God and God's people. I take that because he calls for God to act. It's not just a personal thing. But deliver me from the lying lips and the deceitful tongue. What was being said? I don't know. But he thought it was such an offense that he considered himself as living in the world of the ungodly, and that it deserved this kind of punishment. Now let's go to verses 3 and 4 now. In verse 3, what does he say? Yeah. What shall be given to you? What shall be done, O false tongue? False statements, lies, deceitful, lying lips. And his answer, verse 4, is, yeah. Now remember, this is Hebrew poetry. And I don't know that he is saying, maybe he is, that I hope you're shot through with arrows and that you're burned in the coals. Maybe so. I think it's descriptive of severe punishment, but you may say, well, I think he's saying, I hope the warrior. Maybe it is a warrior. Maybe it is Sennacherib. Maybe it is someone like Sennacherib who is shooting arrows at the people of God and literally attacking the people of God. Whatever the case may be, that what is it that should be done? Well, this is what he thought ought to be done. Sharp arrows of the warrior. In other words, that you'll be defeated in war. I hope you're consumed. I hope that you're burned with the coals of the broom tree. Take that to be a kind of wood that burns hot. At least several commentators observe. Whatever that is, it's something that burns hot and burns fierce. And so I hope a fire is heated and it burns hot, and that you're shot down with an arrow of the warrior, and that you're burned with the coals of the broom tree. That's pretty severe, isn't it? Now, it's at that juncture where Leupold suggests this is not a minor offense. This is not hurt feelings. This is a major offense. Questions or comments thus far? Pretty simple. Now let's go to 5 to 7. His cry is, because I dwell among the ungodly. He said, woe is me that I sojourn in Meshech. Meshech was southeast of the Black Sea, northern Palestine. That I dwell in the tents of Kedar, that's in Syria. That was rather southern Palestine, and now we have northern Palestine. It was south of Syria. So here is the idea that I don't think it's literally that I dwell here and I dwell there. He couldn't be living in both places at the same time. It would be tantamount to someone saying, I need deliverance because I'm living in Atlantic City and Vegas. Those have been called sin cities. There's all kinds of corruption. There's all kinds of sin. There's all kinds of gambling. There's all kinds of prostitution, drinking. And so you say, I live in a world of ungodly. I'm living in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Not at the same time, you're not. So probably these weren't the literal dwelling places of the psalmist. He's just simply saying, I'm living in a world of ungodliness. I'm living in Sin City. Make sense? All right. With that in mind, notice what he said. Verse 6, you tell me. Say again. Yeah, my soul has dwelt too long with those who hate peace. It is that statement that some, like Scroggie, have argued this is probably the days of Hezekiah. I don't know. I take that the dwelling places mentioned in verses 5 and then the statement made in verse 6 that he's among those who have a warlike spirit. He's dwelling among those of a devastating spirit. Those that have, I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, the savage, I think is the word I'm looking for. I'm living among savages. And my soul has dwelt too long there because they hate peace. Now verse 7, what's his point? Overwhelmed, absolutely. That I am for peace and they are for war. And notice that when I speak peace, they are for war. They hate peace. So whoever the oppressor is one that when you try to negotiate, when you try to deal with the problem, when you try to solve the issue, it just makes things worse. And so that's why he cries out for the Lord for deliverance. There is some oppressor lying against me, and I pray for their punishment. I cry for their punishment. I've dwelt too long among the wicked. I've dwelt too long among the wicked. I am for peace, and they are for, they hate peace. They are for war. All right, questions or comments on Psalm 120?
Whether it's in our immediate family who have this contrary spirit, or whether it's in our community or in our state or country or in the whole world, we can apply it in varying degrees outward and still come up with the same answer, that if we come unto God, that He will answer us. And then also with verse 4, when I read that originally, I read it as more of him asking the people of the city, what is it going to take? Is it going to take a warrior sharp arrows and glowing coals of the broom tree for you to listen, because it says, but when I speak, they are for war, verse 7. So it's like he's addressing it. He's trying to find peace. God tells us to make peace with all men as we're able to, and he's trying to, but they're still at war.
All right. Anything else? Practical things you take home with you from Psalm 120. Very good. All right, good.
Down in verse 1, you see where he was in so much distress and he cried out to God. When we're living our life right, and we're doing what God commands us to do, and we're overwhelmed, we can go to God in prayer and be sure that we're going.
All right. That's true. Very good.
I wonder if it's when he says he answered me, if it's not just he's answered me in the past, but I have the confidence that I know when I call out to God, he will answer me.
I'm sure that's the case. Good. Practical things, several things in this psalm. Short psalm, full of practical things. We obviously learned that we cry to God in time of need, whatever our need may be. It may not be that you have an oppressor. It may not be that you have a slanderer. But in a time of need, you cry out to God. From verse 6, 5 and 6, you learn that we have to live among some things that are unpleasant. We have to live among the ungodly. We can't completely go out of the world. Paul mentioned that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We can't go completely out of the world. So we live among the ungodly. But here's an interesting point too, that he said, my soul has dwelt too long with one who hates peace. And I take that much like Lot was vexed with the conversation of the wicked. It began to wear and tear on him. The psalmist is ready for deliverance from this. I've been too long among the ungodly. I've lived too long with this oppressor. I've been slandered way too long. And it's time for deliverance, and I'm crying for it. What else do you learn? You will have enemies. You will have people that lie against you. You will have those that mistreat you. Anything else before we go to Psalm 121? Cry for deliverance, the first song of ascent. All right, let's go to Psalm 120. It is an anonymous psalm, and it is about what? Yeah, he's our helper and our keeper. So look back here, and then we'll come back to our outline. Here are some key words. Our help. And notice that at verse 1, verse 2, the word help is used. And then verse 4 and verse 3, 4, and 5 mention the word keep or keeper. God is my keeper. Mentioned 3 times. He who keeps and is a keeper. And then verse 7 and 8, the word preserve is used 3 times. And that's the same word as keep or keeper. Same root word. It's interesting. So God is my keeper. And what does it mean by keeper? One who preserves. We'll get to that word here in just a moment and say more about that. But those are key words to the psalm. Now this is interesting. Some have suggested, when I say interesting, that Psalm 120 describes a problem. Psalm 121 is the answer. Meaning by that I cry out for deliverance, but God is my keeper. God is the one who will keep and preserve and help me and all of the problems. Well, he said that in Psalm 120, but this is an entirely different psalm, but it may be the answer to that problem. So Jehovah, the keeper of his people. So verses 1 and 2, help is from the Lord. Verses 3 and 4, the Lord watches and does not sleep. And then 5 to 8, the Lord protects and preserves. So, simple psalm, yet packed full of some Very important information here. So here is part of the idea of this theory that many of the scholars think is the songs of ascent, and that is maybe as they're making their way toward Jerusalem, is that the city now is in sight. And he said, I will lift up my eyes to the hills. And there's discussion as to what the hills are, probably, and I think it probably has reference to Jerusalem and all that is involved with the temple as they're making their way to the city of Jerusalem. And that may not be the case, but I will lift up my eyes to the hills. And he asks the question, from whence comes my help? And so here's the idea of I'm needing help, and where does my help come from? And look at verse 2. His answer is, my help is from the Lord. But what does he say about the Lord? Who made the heaven and the earth. So he refers to God's omnipotent power. Now, what does that suggest to you? I know God made heavens and the earth. But if you were in trouble, let's just word it this way. If you were in trouble and you say, I need help, I really need help, and somebody, a fellow Christian, said, your help is going to come from the Lord who made the heavens and the earth. Why would they mention that? You already know that. He has the power. If God made the heavens and the earth, he controls the heavens and the earth. If God made the heavens and the earth, he has control over the people of the earth. So whatever the problem, it may be an oppressor of Psalm 120. It may be a king. It might be a nation. It might be whatever the case may be. If God made the heavens and the earth, he can control the heavens and the earth, and consequently, he is the one that has the power. So it's an appeal to God's omnipotent power that he has. So my help comes from the Lord who made all things. We need a good dose of that. I think sometimes we recognize God is our help, but we don't put our full confidence in the power that he has, that he is in control of all things. Remember Nehemiah 9. You might make a marginal note. Nehemiah 9, 6-8. And I'm just going to paraphrase what you learned there, that God created a world that he could control to fulfill his purpose. That's not worded that way in that text. You read verses 6, 7, and 8 and 9 of Nehemiah 9, particularly 6, 7, and 8. You're going to conclude God created a world that he could control to carry out his purpose. So if God can do that and rules in the kingdoms of men, Daniel 5, he can be my help in time of trouble, whatever that may be. All right, now let's talk about the God that helps us. What do we learn in verses 3 and 4? This is a psalm of trust, obviously. And so why should I put trust in God? He's always on duty, absolutely. He will not allow your feet to be moved. God's not going to allow your feet to be moved or slip. Some have made an inference here. Whether that's the point or not, I'll just leave for you to decide because I'm not sure myself. That if this is the song of ascent in the sense they're making these were songs that they sung as they're getting near Jerusalem or making their way to Jerusalem, their roads are not obviously smooth roads, and so there's possibility of slipping and stumbling and falling along the way. That's not really what he's focusing on here. But in comparison to slipping and falling on the road, your God will help you spiritually and you'll never slip. You're not going to be stumbling. You're not going to be falling. You're not going to be slipping. And so he will not allow your foot to slip. Now notice he who keeps you, that's obviously a reference to God, will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. What does that mean? He's always there. I forgot which writer I read today said that some of the Canaanite gods, it may have been the god of fertility or maybe the god of their that saw to their plants and their vegetation, etc. That sometimes when something didn't go well, maybe their cattle weren't fertile, or maybe the vegetation or their crops didn't, their God was sleeping. And perhaps next time he'll be awake when we call upon him for This God never sleeps and he never slumbers. He's always awake. He's always alert. Now, look at that's verse 3 and 4. So he's always there. He's always working. He's always on duty. Now, let's start with verse 5 and finish the psalm. Now, this gets interesting because the Lord protects and preserves, but he talks about the quality of that. First of all, at verse 5, the Lord is your keeper, same word that we saw in verse 3 and 4. The Lord is the shade at your right hand. Now, that may not mean much to us, but what would that mean to those in the Mideast? Yes, it not only was, you're right, it was relief, it was survival. So you had to have shade to survive. And God will provide that shade for you so that you can provide. God's not going to leave you in the scorching sun. He's not talking about literally in the sun, but what he's saying, in the midst of your troubles, God provides the shade for your survival. He's protecting you from the sun. So there's complete protection. Look at verse 6. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. You're not going to be struck by the sun or the moon. There is complete protection from God. Now, verse 6 implies something else. If he never sleeps or slumbers, his protection and preservation is at all times. How do I know that? Verse 6. Yeah, day or night. He's not going to let the sun or the moon hinder us. So he'll protect you in the sun, he'll protect you in the moon, day or night. So at all times. Now let's get verse 7 with that. He preserves the soul from evil. The Lord shall preserve you, same word for keep. He shall preserve you from all evil. He shall preserve your soul. What does that mean? He's going to protect us. Now let's stop for a moment. We'll come back to the psalm. Is there any promise like that for New Testament Christians? All right. Yeah. You're not allowed to be tempted greater than we can bear, 1 Corinthians 10:13. More thought-provoking. I'm not looking for any one particular answer. Could we say, let's go back to the wording of our psalm, that the Lord preserves us from all evil and he shall preserve your soul? Yeah. All right. All right, that's a good point. Absolutely. Yeah. Seek first the kingdom of heaven. These things will be added to you. Matthew chapter 6:33. 1 Peter talks about 1 Peter chapter 1. I'm looking for my here we are, 1 Peter 1 and verse 5. You're kept by the power of God through faith. That is the concept of protecting you, as with one writer says, a garrison of soldiers. One writer says it's like protecting the king. So that cohort of soldiers around the king, or as we think of Secret Service, that surround the president, that protect him wherever he goes. God provides protection. That doesn't mean that I can't lose my soul. It's conditional, but God provides protection. If these things are in you and abound, you shall be neither barren nor unfruitful. So God guarantees you follow this plan, your soul is protected. Does that make sense? And so that's the point, I think, here in this psalm, same kind of point. Now let's go to verse 8 to finish that psalm. The Lord shall preserve your going in, or your going out and your coming in, from this time forth and even forevermore. So what's that about? The going out and coming in probably alludes to the going out in the early morning to your task and then coming back into your dwelling that night. So that's the totality of your day. So in other words, God protects you in all your activities. The Lord is the keeper of his people. So what does that mean to me? Well, the help comes from the Lord. He never sleeps or slumbers, but he gives complete protection at all times. He preserves our soul, what's important, and he protects us in all of our activities, from the going out to the coming in. Make sense? All right, practical things from 121 that you take home with you. Psalm 121.
Well, to preserve is the opposite of to corrupt, like we were talking about a couple months ago, like the devil, sin, is corruption, right? So I don't like that word. It's the antithesis.
Okay. All right, good point. Good point. The Lord's always watching at all times. He never sleeps or slumbers. He's always watching. And He's watching out for you. He's preserving you. All right, let's go to Psalm 122. Let's see if we can get through that one. What is the psalm about? It's obviously a prayer, but a prayer for what? Prayer for peace. A prayer for peace for the city of Jerusalem. All right. We'll get to the peace in just a moment. I take it that David here, David is the author. Some question that. Several scholars question David is not the author. And that's because it's missing from the Septuagint and from the Vulgate translation. Septuagint, I put a lot of confidence in, not as much the Vulgate, though it's a good translation, I assume. But the Hebrew text has David as the author. I take it that David is probably talking for the typical Israelite rather than speaking just of David himself. But be that as it may, let's look at verses 1 and 2. He delights in going to Jerusalem. This is part of what argues for this is the songs for ascending to Jerusalem. That I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. In other words, as the tribe is getting together and your clan, you're going to go in groups, when they said, we're ready to go. We're ready to take off. We're visiting to go for one of the annual feast. And he said, I was delighted. I was glad. I was thrilled when they said it's time to go to the house of the Lord. Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Several comments have been made about verse 2, and none of which are contradictory, but some suggest he's anticipating being there as if he's already there. I'm so excited, it's like my feet are already standing in Jerusalem. I just take verses 1 and 2, he delights in going to Jerusalem. Now in 3 to 5, we're going to quickly hit that because I want to get to the heart of the prayer for peace. In verses 3 to 5 is just a description of Jerusalem. I was glad when they said, let's go to the house of the Lord. I'm just going to paraphrase verses 3 to 5. We're going to Jerusalem, this great city. Well, what is it about this city? Well, verses 3 to 5, now he said, Jerusalem is built. In other words, it's a city that is compact together. There's magnificent buildings. It's a compact city. It's where the tribes go to the testimony of Israel to give thanks. That argues for unity. That's how one of the things that would unite the nation of Israel is they go to Jerusalem together. They go for the purpose of worship for 3 annual feasts. Verse 5, it's a place where the courts take place. It's where it's the capital city, the throne, which David established, 2 Kings chapter 15. So you say, what's the point of verses 3 to 5? He's just simply saying that we admire the city. It's a great, wonderful city. It's a place that God has chosen for the seat of worship. And so I was glad when they said, let's go to Jerusalem. Well, what about the city? Well, it's a magnificent city, verses 3 to 5. But 6 to 9 gets to the heart of the point of the psalm. What's he saying in 6 to 9?
Almost like he's praying for longevity.
All right.
City, temple of worship.
Yeah, look at this word peace. Now, words are repeated in the previous psalm. We have the same thing here. Pray for peace for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper with love. Peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palace. Notice again, verse 8, peace be within you because of the house of God, our Lord. Now let's break that down and look and see what he just said about this prayer for peace. Seemingly, he's praying for the peace for the city of Jerusalem. But he does more than that. Notice at verse 7, he said, peace be within your walls, prosperity within your palaces. He prays for the people first. Then he prays, for the sake of my brethren and companion, peace be within you. He prays for the city. He prays for the people of the city. He prays for the city. And then thirdly, he prays because of the house of the Lord. I will seek your good. So what's he saying? What he's saying is, I admire the city, verses 3 to 5. I was glad when we were going, because we're going there for worship. I admire this great city, marvelous city it is, verses 3 to 5. But I'm praying for peace. I pray for the people of the city. I pray for the city, and I pray for the house of God within the city. Does that make sense? Now notice the last phrase, verse 9. Because of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. Luther translated that, I will seek what is best for you. Best for what? For Jerusalem? Yeah. For the house of God? Yeah. I'm going to seek what's best for Jerusalem and the house of God. So, that ought to be our prayer, that there's peace in Jerusalem, peace in Israel, and we're going to do what's best for the house of God. Make sense? We have time for a few practical lessons. What have you learned from Psalm 122?
We should pray the same thing for our church here, for peace and prosperity.
Absolutely. Pray for harmony and peace. Think of the power of that if every member here thank God for the unity we have and for the continued unity. The power that would have for the future. Not a bad idea, is it? What else? Take home with you from Psalm 122.
Realize that verse 1, our attitude when it comes time for worship. Be ready, let's go.
Yeah. Today's the day of worship. I'm excited rather than I have to go, man. I'm excited. I was glad when they said unto me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Do a little work on that word glad. You might see some excitement in that word. What else? What else do you take home with you? If my understanding of verse 2 be correct, following verse 1, it may be saying, I'm going to paraphrase, I was so excited when they said it's time to go, and in my mind, I've already got my feet there in Jerusalem. And that ought to be our attitude in going to worship. It's like when it's time to go, I was excited when they said it's time to go. In my mind, I'm already there in the assembly. I can't wait. I want to be there. What else? We got time for one more.
The clear parallel to the church, verse 9, very impactful. Is I'll seek your good. That's not just wishing for good, but that's doing something about it.
Very good. Yeah. Proactive in that, not just a matter of, I hope it happens, but working toward that. Yes, sir. Say that again. I think it would have to be written before if it's from David, but perhaps used and assembled in this Psalter based upon the assembly of that. We'll stop there. Dan, if you'll push that again for us, please.